Okay, so I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through a lot of the major topics of period 5, which is 1844 to 1877. All right, starting off with the election of 1844. The election of 1844 was won by James K. Polk. And Polk ran on largely a platform of expansion, right? He wanted to expand the United States. His victory pushed Congress to officially annex Texas. So if we remember from period 4, there was the revolution in Texas where American settlers in Texas sort of defeated and overthrew Mexican rule. But for a while, Texas was sort of its own little independent nation. Congress had held off on annexing it because they knew it was going to cause a beef with Mexico. But when Polk wins the election of 1844, that pushes Congress, and he runs on an expansionist platform. It pushes Congress to go ahead and annex Texas. Polk also ran on adding Oregon to the United States. He originally was pushing to get all the way up into what's now Canada. But when he takes office, he negotiates with Great Britain to basically split it up, and the United States got all of this orange territory that back then was just simply known as the Oregon Territory. So right off the bat, in period 5, the United States is growing. It's starting to expand. And Polk is a big part of that. Now, going back to the issue with Texas. We knew that annexing Texas was going to cause a beef with Mexico, and it did. So this leads to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. The Mexican-American War starts with a dispute over where the border of Texas ends and where the border of Mexico begins. For Mexico, they claimed that the Nueces River was the southern border of Texas. The United States claimed that the Rio Grande was the border of Texas. So all of that sort of green-colored territory in there was disputed, okay, particularly down in here. Mexico said it was Mexico. The U.S. said it was part of Texas. In 1846, Mexican troops captured an American patrol and killed several American soldiers in that disputed area. Which leads Congress to declare war. 1846, as far as Congress is concerned, Mexico captured and killed American troops on American soil. And so Congress overwhelmingly declares war on Mexico. The war itself was reasonably uneventful. The United States pretty quickly dispatched Mexico's army. And by the next year, towards the end of 1847, the U.S. Army had captured Mexico City, as shown in the painting here of the U.S. Army entering the defeated capital of Mexico. Once Mexico City falls, Mexico really doesn't have much choice than to surrender. And that leads to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is written down in the key terms. This is 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did in ending the war is it established the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. Right? So that gray area that was kind of disputed, that became undisputed U.S. territory.
So we gained a lot more.
So we gained, through this disputed area, Mexico gave up its claim to. They said, all right, the Rio Grande is the southern border, and everything above the Rio Grande is U.S. territory. It also, in the treaty also, sold this darker area here, what's now the American Southwest, including California, sold that land to the United States for $15 million. So all of this territory right in here we get as a result of the Mexican-American War.
I called the Northwest or right?
Southwest. The very dark area right there, we add later on. That's not part of the treaty. We end up buying that from Mexico later on. And so those who supported the war felt like this was a wonderful outcome, a great result for America, a patriotic military victory, and we gained a lot of land. Critics of the war really argued that this was nothing more than a land grab, right? That we had gone to war simply to acquire all this land, and they were not pleased with that. So territorial expansion, right? Major theme of period 4 bleeding into period 5. All right. Famous painting here, titled American Progress. And we've seen this picture before, right? That ties into that concept of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a hugely popular belief in this time period, right? The belief that we were destined to take over the entirety of the American continent from Atlantic to Pacific. And by 1848, the United States had largely acquired all of that land, right? This land right here is the area we just talked about. What was Mexico became the United States. We get Oregon from Great Britain. So all of this area here, by 1848, this whole area right here is now the United States, and manifest destiny is largely achieved. Americans started moving west in larger and larger numbers. Most of them following the paths of the lines here. These are some of the various trails, overland trails. Most famous would be the Oregon Trail, right? Perhaps best known because they turned it into a game. the numbers of people moving westward really exploded after 1848. I said 1848, all of this land here is now the United States. And something really important happens right here at Sutter's Fort in 1848. And what would that be? The discovery of gold. Okay? The discovery of gold in 1848 in California was major news, and by the next year, huge numbers of Americans are trekking across the continent, hoping to strike it rich in California. Many of them don't, and instead settle in places like San Francisco. In fact, so many people come to San Francisco in 1849 that they get called the 49ers. Hence, San Francisco's football team is called the 49ers. Most people traveling out to the west took that overland route. They didn't have the money to sail all the way around South America. So in these covered wagons, they brought pretty much everything they had to strike it out to the west and give it a shot. At first, most of those people are following those trails out to California and Oregon along the coast. Over time, more and more of them settle on the Great Plains. So the United States is growing in territory. The United States is geographically expanding from period 4 into period 5. All right. We also know that there was economic expansion throughout this time period. In the north, industrialization changes life. Right? We know about the factory system, the mills that sprang up in the north. Many of them, like Slater's Mill, one of the very first in America in Rhode Island, along the rivers, lots of flowing rivers in New England, but eventually steam power makes it so that mills can be anywhere. Industrialization rapidly changes life in the north. More and more people leave their homes and start working for wages in factories. More and more people are moving to towns and cities. Primarily, the South misses out on this industrialization and remains tied to an agricultural economy, right? Primarily cotton production. And we know that already. And that lack of industrialization is going to play a major role in the Civil War, right? Factories can produce the things you need to win wars, and when the North has way more factories than the South, that's going to help the North during the war. The South, obviously tied to a system of slave labor to produce cotton. At the time, the South, the American South, was the largest exporter of cotton in the world. So it's not a small industry, right? The entirety of Southern economy depended upon slave labor, crop production, especially cotton. Speaking of slavery, let's talk about the expansion of slavery, some major terms. Again, I know I'm moving kind of quick here, so if you need to skip something to catch up, I'll post this video. As we start adding more land, this is outside of period 5, but we've talked about it and it's related, right? We know that we have the Missouri Compromise, which was designed to settle the question once and for all, right? The Missouri Compromise drew a line across the Louisiana Territory and said, okay, other than Missouri, above that line, no slavery. Below the line, you can have it. right? 2 new states get added, Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state. Keep things equal between slave states and free states. And everyone's happy, except not really. But it solves the problem for a little while. Most Americans at this time, not all, but most, accepted slavery where it already existed. But the key issue becomes these territories, right? And whether, as we expand, will slavery be allowed into these new territories? The Missouri Compromise ultimately doesn't work because we know we're going to add all of this area here, and it's not covered. So the more we add, the question becomes, will that area be slave or free? We're going to have the same arguments over and over and over again. You had groups like Free Soilers. Free Soilers were largely Northerners who wanted the territories to be off limits to slavery. Free Soilers wanted the soil reserved for free men. They did not want slavery in the territories. Most of these Free Soilers were not abolitionists. They didn't want to ban slavery because they thought slavery was a terrible crime. They wanted to ban it because slave labor was a threat to free labor. And so that led to conflicts with pro-slavery settlers, right? So the real big issue in the territories is Free Soilers versus pro-slavery settlers. Next major event we'll talk about here is the compromise. Ooh, that just, why does that do that? I just skipped over it real quick. Let me fix that because it's skipping over Compromise of 1850. Oh, that's why. You get off of there. All right, so there's Missouri Compromise. There's Compromise of 1850. All right, so for this one, you can see, now we have added, we said by 1848, all of this area is part of the United States now. Okay? And so we need a new compromise. The Compromise of 1850, again, solves the problem for a little while. What it did was it added California as a free state, and it banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Both of those are things the North liked. Okay, California as a free state, ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The North likes those things. But you can see here, it opened up some new territories to slavery. They would be determined by popular sovereignty. When those territories, Utah and New Mexico, were ready to become states, they would be able to vote for themselves. And much to the hatred of Northerners, it also, the Compromise of 1850 also included a strong fugitive slave law. We talked about that before, how it basically forced Northerners to participate in the capture and return of runaway slaves. Next up was the KansasNebraska Act. All right, now, and if I show you those again, right, look at this territory right here. Compromise of 1850, KansasNebraska Act. All right. The KansasNebraska Act was pushed through and opened Kansas and Nebraska up to slavery through popular sovereignty. Right? It said Kansas and Nebraska were going to organize these territories and they will be determined by popular sovereignty. Southerners loved it. Northerners, not really so much. The reason that Stephen Douglas, now Illinois is a free state, the Illinois senator pushes this through, had to do with a transcontinental railroad. He was hoping for a transcontinental railroad that would end in Chicago, right over here, in his home state. So in order to get Southerners on board with a more northern transcontinental railroad, he's got to give them something. And what he gives them is popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. There's no way we're going to get to all of this before the bell rings, so we're going to split this up. We'll finish this section and we'll do a part 1 and a part 2. Okay? And we know that the KansasNebraska Act leads to violence, right? This leads to, it basically abolished the Missouri Compromise. It got rid of the Missouri Compromise, and it leads to bleeding Kansas. Right? As shown in this cartoon, you had those free soilers fighting with pro-slavery settlers who are rushing in, trying to influence the government and make it either a slave state or a free state. The KansasNebraska Act also caused the birth of a new political party, right, that was so opposed to this, what they saw as this expansion of slave power, that a new political party called the Republican Party was created to oppose this expansion of slavery. We're going to do a couple more real quick and then I'll let you out of here. All right. 3 years after that, 1857, comes the Dred Scott decision. Right? Dred Scott, an enslaved African American who was taken to a free territory, sued, saying, I was taken to a free territory, my wife and I should be free. And in one of the most heinous decisions in Supreme Court history, this guy right here, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, looks like Taney, but it's Taney. Roger Taney issues a decision that basically says, not only are you not free, but black people, enslaved African Americans, aren't even citizens. Right. So a very pro-Southern decision, the Dred Scott decision, appalled Northerners. Southerners celebrated it. Allowed slave owners to pretty much take their slaves wherever they wanted, and told slaves that they were not even citizens. Next major one, we got 2 more to talk about. 1859, John Brown's raid. Should sound familiar. John Brown, ardent abolitionist, leads a raid into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now West Virginia, but at the time it was Virginia, on a federal arsenal, hoping to arm the local slave population, create an uprising, kill lots of white people. He had hoped that this would grow into a full-scale revolution as a way to end slavery. As we can see from the growing, or the evolution of the pictures here, it does not go well for John Brown. Okay. The U.S. Army, led by Robert E. Lee, quickly puts down he did capture the arsenal, but it's quickly surrounded. He and his supporters are captured, and John Brown is hung. John Brown is considered a hero in the North by many, not all, and he is vilified in the South. Again, just kind of pulling the two sides farther apart. The final straw, last thing we'll talk about today, is the election of 1860. Right? For Southerners, they saw this as an attempt by the Republican Party to basically end slavery you have Abraham Lincoln. You basically end up having two different elections. In the North, you have Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, you have John Breckinridge largely running against John Bell. And again, because the North is more populous, more electoral college votes, Lincoln pretty much runs the table in the North and becomes the president. That pushes Southern states to secede from the Union. And at that point, we are on the brink of civil war. So we'll do this as sort of a two-parter. This will be part one. We'll stop there today. And then at the start of class on Monday, we'll wrap up talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction.